Good afternoon, everybody. This video is intended for my Anatomy and Physiology class at DW Poppy. Usually I like to do this live, but with COVID, can't do it, so we're coming to you live from my kitchen. And today we're talking about the digestive system, the organs, the order of the food that goes through, the pH of the different organs, the food groups and the enzymes, and the substrates and the products that are formed from that chemical breakdown. Okay. I have emailed you or put on the server MS Teams a little note sheet so you can see and sort of follow along with me as we go through here. So feel free to have that in front of you and make little marks on it or whatever it is that you need to do during the video. Okay. So as you can see, we're having a lunch. I'm having a little peanut butter sandwich, a little peanut butter jam, a little bit of apple here, some potato chips, and oh, I don't have anything to drink, but we'll get that later. So today, first thing we want to do is identify our food groups. Okay, so in my sandwich here, we've got carbohydrates in the bread, a little bit of bran in there. We're not going to count that right now. The peanut butter, which would count as what? What food group was that? Carbs, proteins, fats, or nucleic acids. In the macromolecules, it is correct. It's both protein and lipids. So there's protein in there and there's fat in there. Carbs in the bread. The apple would represent cellulose and some simple sugars as well. And as you remember, cellulose has a cross-linked or up and down linked carbon chains that cannot be broken down by the enzymes in our digestive system. And then the potato chips would be carbs, again, because they're made of potatoes, which is carbs. And because they're boiled in fat, a little bit of lipids in there as well. So first things first, when we take the little sandwich, we start to chew, obviously, and there's a function in that. So when we chew, what we're doing, we're taking that food and we're breaking it into tiny little bits. We're increasing the surface area so that there are more active sites for the enzymes to work on in the mouth and also a little bit later. Okay, we have sharp teeth in front for cutting. We have back teeth, the molars, for crushing, again, to make smaller pieces, increase the surface area, okay, so they can find more active sites. And also don't forget we've got saliva, which moistens the food, dissolves it, allows us to taste it, and also now allows it to go down our esophagus somewhat in a slippery fashion. So there's a whole bunch of functions to saliva, okay? So we just have to, we've got to put our sandwich in here and kind of rush in a little bit so I can't chew up that. So this is the squishy of our mouth and our teeth in here, and I have here in front of me some beakers that represent enzymes. This is SA for salivary amylase. Salivary amylase is in our saliva, and it will start to break down the starch in the bread into smaller molecules called maltose. Maltose is a disaccharide. It has 2 carbon chains. So that is salivary amylase. So a little bit in there, a little bit of moisten up there. Put some more sandwich in here, a little bit more sandwich in here. Perfect, okay. And the squishy. Lovely. Now, we're also eating some potato chips, which are fats, lipids, and carbohydrates. And with salivary amylase, we'll work on that. Okay? And don't forget our apple. Gotta have your fruit. This is mostly cellulose. There's some sugar in here too, but we're going to count on fruits as mostly cellulose. Many glucose molecules linked together in a fashion that it's very difficult to break down because that oxygen bond goes over. We did that in the first week of Anatomy and Physiology. And so apple's going in there too. And because we want to speed that up, I pre-cut some apple. We'll just put that in there like this. So here's our mixture. Some soft. And your mouth is doing this, right? Tongue pushing it into the teeth smashing into small bits, increasing the surface area, And now your tongue pushes it to the back, where there's a pipe in the front and a pipe in the back. The pipe in the front is your trachea. It is always open so that you can breathe, okay? But there's a little trap door that has to close to allow the food to slide over top of the trachea and go into the esophagus, okay? The esophagus is not, the trachea is always open like an elevator shaft, like a hose or a pipe. It's always open. That is so that air can always go in and out. We don't want to restrict the air. When the food passes the trachea, the epiglottis has to close down. Epi is on top of, so the epiglottis goes on top of the trachea. The food slides over top and now goes into the esophagus. This bag is going to represent our esophagus, okay? So when some food goes into the esophagus, I'm just going to use my knife here. This is probably not very safe. When the food is introduced into the esophagus like this, right? It doesn't fall down, it gets squished down. So what happens is you have some circular muscles and some lengthwise or longitudinal muscles, and they, oh, that fell down there. That doesn't happen like that. This is closed, and what happens is it goes squishy, 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 and the food basically it gets pushed down there a little by little, like you're icing a cake, right? It's like you're icing a cake. So if this is, I'll get that later. If this is my food, it goes squishy, 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 like this. Okay, and so then it comes out, obviously at the bottom, and at the bottom of the esophagus is the stomach. There's a little valve there called the cardiac sphincter, and the cardiac sphincter makes sure that when food goes into the stomach from the esophagus, it does not pop back out. This motion, this contraction of the circular and longitudinal muscles is called peristalsis, and that's what pushes food all the way through your digestive system, not just the esophagus, okay? Now, in the stomach, a couple more things get added, okay? We have, I'm gonna put my sandwich in there. We didn't chew it up very much. We have inside there two things. We have pepsin, which is an enzyme that starts to break down the proteins, and it will break proteins into a slightly smaller molecule called a peptide, and I think you know what a peptide is. And then also hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid, or HCl, is obviously an acid. It's a very strong acid, and it creates a very, very low pH environment, and the pH of the stomach is about 2, okay? Pepsin is the enzyme that works best at that pH. As I said, it's breaking down the protein into peptides, so pepsin peptides. And what the stomach does is it churns, because it also has circular muscle and longitudinal muscle, and your stomach will work away on that mixture, kneading it and crushing it and smashing it up, okay? There's no absorption yet, it's just breaking down. But the cool thing about the stomach is that's where any viruses or bacteria or parasites that you ingested on your food hopefully get killed by the pH. So the low pH of the stomach is set up well to help work with our immune system to make sure that you don't get pathogens in there, okay? So after a couple hours of smashing around in the stomach, it's now start to broken down. And now we have a mixture called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. And the chyme is just a complex mixture of food and acid. And now it will pass from the stomach into the very beginning of the small intestine. And the very beginning of the small intestine has a special name called the duodenum. Some people call it duodenum. It's the same thing, okay? At that point where it goes in, there's yet another valve. So we had the cardiac sphincter up high, and the next one is the pyloric sphincter. Pyloric is anything to do with the stomach is pyloric. After that little valve opens, the pyloric sphincter opens. Now that food can pass into the small intestine. In the small intestine, the very beginning, you have now a little duct. One comes from the pancreas and one comes from the bile, or comes from the gallbladder. The gallbladder is part of the pancreas. It makes a brown substance called bile. Bile is a very interesting stuff. What it does is it acts as an emulsifier. So as you have to have soap when you wash the dishes to get the fat to dissolve, bile acts to have the fat dissolve in your food as well. So bile is an emulsifier, but it is not, I repeat, it is not a chemical change, it is a physical change. There's no chemical change in your sink when you wash dishes. It's a physical change. You're just making the fat droplets smaller and able to dissolve in water. Now, you'll notice that the brown color that I'm starting to get is going to be the color of something we'll talk about soon, okay? Now, right after this chyme is introduced into the small intestine, the pancreas, that funny little organ that does all sorts of stuff, adds a couple things. One, it adds 4 enzymes, pancreatic amylase, which sounds like the first amylase we had, that also breaks down starch into maltose. Then we have trypsin, which is now going to also break down the protein. So we have 2 protein breaking enzymes, pepsin from the stomach and trypsin from the pancreas. Okay. And we have lipase, which is going to break down fats. And just remember how that sounds, or is spelled lipase, or it sounds like lipids because it has to do with fat. So it's going to break down fats. And then nuclease, a tremendous amount of what we eat is DNA, and we have to break it down. There's a ton of DNA in this guy. Okay, it's all cells, and every cell has a nucleus, and every nucleus has lots of DNA in it. We have to break that down. Now, this mixture now is going to also get squished up, and as you can see, it's becoming more liquidy, okay, and is getting softer. Okay, this material, okay, now starts to move down the small intestine, and the small intestine also produces enzymes, okay? Remember, we broke the proteins into peptides. Now we have to break the peptides into individual amino acids. So that's going to be accomplished by the peptidase. So there's a little bit of peptidase goes in there, okay? The sugar, the starch that we broke down in our mouth, and at the very beginning with the pancreatic amylase formed maltose. Now we want to break the maltose into glucoses, a disaccharide into a monosaccharide. That is the function of maltase. And the next one is nucleosidase. We broke the DNA into nucleotides. Nucleotides have 3 parts to it. Remember the DNA unit. Now we want to break it into the phosphate group, the organic base, and the deoxyribose sugar, okay? So now the nucleosidase, we have nuclease, nucleosidase goes in there. The small intestine is about 7 to 8 meters long or so. Right now, you'll notice that our food mixture is extremely liquidy, okay? And that allows it to easily pass down the small intestine, again, by peristalsis, and that is where absorption is going to happen. So all of our materials that we ate, the lipids, the proteins, the carbs, the nucleic acids, are first broken into slightly smaller molecules and then broken down into now even smaller basic building block molecules. In the small intestine, the digestion is now complete, okay? It's been broken down. Now absorption happens. So the small intestine is designed with lots of little folds and projections called villi, which now contact the food and absorb those nutrients into the bloodstream or into the lymphatic system as well. So now the glucose is going into the blood, the amino acids are going into the blood, the breakdown products of lipids, glycerol, and nucleic acids are going into the blood, into the lipids, into the lymphatic system, and the products of nucleic acid breakdown are going into the bloodstream too. So all that stuff is getting absorbed by the small intestine. Now, after its little trip through the small intestine, again, a couple more hours, the small intestine goes from being a small diameter pipe to a large diameter pipe, which is now called the large intestine, and that large intestine goes up and across and down. So if you open up a person's abdomen, you can see it. It's called the ascending, transverse, and descending colon. So colon and large intestine, same. In its trip through there, you'll notice that this stuff is extremely watery, okay? And so what the couple functions of the large intestine, the first is to now suck back or reabsorb all the water, because as animals that live on the land, we cannot afford to lose that moisture. So this little paper towel represents the reabsorption of my water, okay? And so if I stick it in here and just dab it like this, all of a sudden, oh look, it's all watery here. So that's what the small intestine is, that it sucks back that water and dries out this mixture, okay? The second thing it does is there's a tremendous amount of bacteria that live in there that are good for us. They're called mutualistic bacteria, and they break down products that we can't break down, and the waste for them is useful for us. So those bacteria are called E. coli, that's the abbreviated name. Hopefully they stay in the large intestine. If they get into the bloodstream or the small intestine, it's very bad, causes infections. But in the intestine, it is chock-a-block full of large bacteria called E. coli, which is a rod-shaped bacteria in there. Those two things together are the major functions of the large intestine. If the large intestine if its function is somehow impaired, maybe by disease, and maybe dysentery, colitis, something like that, and the lining of that large intestine is infected or inflamed, now this food passes through the large intestine really, really quickly. And when it does, the water is not reabsorbed, and as a result, what comes out are not solid feces, right? It's more of a watery mixture, which we call diarrhea. If you lose a lot of water in your digestive system, if you have diarrhea, that can cause severe dehydration. And when people die from things like amoebic dysentery and are affected by diseases like Giardia, they lose so much water that they can die from that dehydration. So that obviously has to be dealt with, okay? Peristalsis, again, is great to move that mixture through the large intestine, up, across, and down. And then we come to the very end where there is yet one more little ring of muscle called the anal sphincter. So we have the cardiac sphincter, the pyloric sphincter, and then the anal sphincter, okay? All this peristalsis has brought this food to the very end. Little kids have no control over their anal sphincter. You learn that when you get toilet trained, how to keep that ring of muscle closed. And then after you figure that out, your hypothalamus says, hey, we got to go to the bathroom. And so you make a conscious effort to relax that muscle. And when you relax your anal sphincter, now you have obviously the waste product. So in biology, we call this feces. This is the fecal matter, okay? And it should be only stuff that is waste. This is not excretion. Excretion is a totally different process. This is elimination, the removal of this solid waste. And this material in here is not usable, okay? It's 70% of it or so, its mass is just pure bacteria, so it's mostly bacteria. The brown color in feces has come from our bile. They came from the breakdown of red blood cells in our liver, believe it or not. All those recycled red blood cells have given us bile, which has given us the color of the feces. And it smells bad because of the byproduct of the bacteria. So it smells bad, it looks brown because of the bile, and it's mostly bacteria. But there's nothing in here that's useful. The large intestine does not absorb nutritionally valuable molecules. The glucose is gone, amino acids are gone. They all got sucked up in the small intestine. This guy here only reabsorbs water and now allows us to produce a few vitamins because of the bacteria that are living in there that are processing that waste product into something that happens to be useful for us. But for the most part, we don't do any absorption other than water in the large intestine. If there's anything in here that is useful, then your large intestine or your whole digestive system is not working properly. So if you sit down and eat corn, for example, and you don't chew the corn kernels because the outside is made out of carbohydrate, cellulose, right, which you can't absorb. If you just swallow whole corn kernels, they will pass right through your system and they will come out in this material looking exactly like they went in. And hopefully what comes out does not look like went in. Thanks for watching us today, and obviously some questions will follow. You people have a good day. Bye-bye.